Plain script. There are places on this earth that were built to save lives, and then were left to lose their own. This lighthouse stood at the edge of a desert that most people do not believe exists. Not the desert of sand dunes and cinematic sunsets. The other kind. The kind that is flat and pale and so relentlessly bright that it bleaches everything it touches: wood, stone, metal, memory. The kind that does not consume things dramatically. It simply erases them. Slowly. Completely. Without apology. This lighthouse had been erased. The light was gone. The keeper's quarters had collapsed into themselves. The tower, which had once been the tallest thing for 40 miles in every direction, now stood not as a beacon but as a monument to its own abandonment, cracked and sun-bleached and holding nothing inside but heat and silence and the particular loneliness of a thing that was built to matter and then was forgotten. We did not restore it. We returned it to itself. To understand what this lighthouse became, you have to understand what it was built to be, and why that makes its abandonment one of the stranger stories a building can tell. Most lighthouses exist in relationship with water. They are coastal things, cliff-edge things, built at the margins where land surrenders to sea and ships need to know where the danger begins. This one was different. It was built not for ships but for caravans. Not for water but for the absence of it. In an era when trade routes crossed this desert with regularity, when the movement of goods and people through this pale, bleached landscape was a matter of genuine economic consequence, a lighthouse here made a particular kind of sense. It told travelers where they were. It told them that someone knew they were out there. It told them, in the language that all lighthouses speak regardless of their location, that they were not as alone as they felt. That language eventually went silent. The trade routes shifted. The caravans found other ways. The desert, which had never particularly cared about human movement across its surface, continued doing what it had always done, holding still, reflecting heat, erasing things. The lighthouse keeper left. Then the lighthouse itself was left. And the desert began its slow, patient, thorough work of reclaiming what had been placed upon it. What remained, decades later, was not ruins in the romantic sense. Ruins imply drama, fallen columns, collapsed arches, the picturesque violence of things that were once grand. This was quieter than that. This was a structure that had simply been drained. Of color. Of purpose. Of the human presence that had once made it mean something. It stood exactly where it had always stood, in exactly the shape it had always held, but it was empty in a way that went deeper than the absence of furniture or glass or a functioning light at its summit. It was empty of intention. That was what needed to come back first. Before anything else, before materials, before design decisions, before the first conversation about what this place could become, there was a long period of simply being in it. This is not a romantic idea. It is a practical one. A space that has been abandoned carries in its walls and its floors and its particular quality of silence a record of everything that has happened to it. To design well for a space like this, you have to learn to read that record. To understand not just the damage but the original intention beneath the damage. To find, underneath everything that time has done, the thing that was always there and still is. What was always here was light. Not the light from the tower, though that too, in its time, had defined this place. The light of the desert itself. The particular quality of illumination that exists in landscapes this open and this pale and this relentlessly exposed to the sun. It is not gentle light. It is not the soft, diffused light of cloudy northern coastlines or the dappled light of forests. It is direct and honest and without softness, and it falls on everything here with an equality that is almost democratic. Every surface receives the same attention, the same intensity, the same bleaching pressure that over years turns colors into suggestions of themselves. To design with this light rather than against it was the central decision. Everything followed from that. The palette emerged from the desert itself. Warm sandstone. The pale gold of sun-dried earth. Terracotta that deepened in the late afternoon when the angle of the light changed and the landscape shifted from bleached to burnished. Clay whites that held warmth without weight. Raw linen textures that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Aged brass and hammered copper that caught the sun and gave it back in a way that felt less like decoration and more like the desert's own color finding its way inside. The tower itself would remain stone, because the tower had always been stone, and the desert had not damaged it so much as seasoned it, and there is a difference between those two things that matters enormously when you are deciding what to keep and what to replace. The keeper's quarters, which had suffered more, would be rebuilt with materials that honored the original without pretending to be it. New things made honestly, in conversation with old things made the same way. The goal was a space that felt as though it had always been exactly this. Not restored. Not renovated. Not transformed. Simply, returned. Brought back to a version of itself that the original builders, if they could have seen it, would have recognized as the thing they were always trying to build. A lighthouse does not exist independently of its landscape. It never did. It was always part of a larger relationship, between the built and the natural, between human intention and the environment that surrounds it, between the specific place where something was constructed and the much larger place that construction now belongs to. Here, the landscape was the desert. And the desert, in its particular way, had opinions. The ground around the lighthouse was not the ground of softer environments. It did not yield. It did not accommodate. It held its character absolutely, pale and hard and warm to the touch even before the sun had been on it long, scored with the patterns that wind and heat and the occasional desert rain make over decades in surfaces that have no softness to give. Working with this ground rather than replacing it was not just an aesthetic decision. It was a statement of honesty about where this place was and what it was part of. Stone pathways were laid in the existing earth with the care of someone who understands that a path through a landscape like this is not simply a practical convenience. It is a relationship. It tells you where to go and, in doing so, tells you something about how the person who laid it understood the land. These paths curved where the terrain asked them to curve. They followed the logic of the ground rather than imposing a different logic upon it. They connected the tower to the quarters to the courtyard to the edge of the property where the desert began again without apology and continued in every direction as far as the eye could trace it. The courtyard became the heart of the outdoor space, a walled enclosure that captured the warmth of the desert without fully exposing itself to its intensity. Low plantings in terracotta vessels. A central water feature, modest in scale but extraordinary in effect. The sound of water in a landscape this dry changes the atmosphere of a space in a way that is difficult to describe and impossible to ignore. Date palms positioned not for symmetry but for the particular quality of shade they cast in the afternoon, long and precise and moving slowly across the stone floor as the sun moved. This courtyard was designed to be used at every hour of the day and every season of the year. In the early morning, when the desert light is still golden and the air has not yet committed to its daytime heat, it would be the kind of place where you sit with something warm to drink and feel, without trying to, completely at peace. In the deep afternoon, when the sun is at its most serious, the walls and the palms and the shade they provide together create a microclimate of genuine relief. And in the evening, when the desert sky does the thing that desert skies do, turns colors that have no names in any practical vocabulary, the courtyard becomes something close to perfect. The tower was always going to be the center of this. Not the largest space, not the most lived in, not the most practically important, but the center, because it had always been the center. This was the thing that was built to be seen from 40 miles away. This was the thing that had given this entire property its reason for existing. Everything else here, the keeper's quarters, the courtyard, the outbuildings, existed in service of the tower and the light it carried. To restore this place without restoring the tower to genuine significance would have been to miss the point entirely. The interior of the tower was narrow, as tower interiors always are, and the narrowness was used rather than apologized for. A staircase of warm sandstone rose in a continuous spiral from ground level to the lantern room at the summit, not a reconstruction of what had been there but a new interpretation of it, in materials that belonged here and proportions that served the ascent rather than simply accommodating it. Each step was slightly different from the last, the way handmade things are always slightly different from each other, and this variation was not a flaw but a feature. It made the climb feel like progress rather than repetition. The walls of the tower interior were left as they were. Stone that had been here since the beginning, that had held the desert heat and the desert cold and the particular dryness of this air for longer than anyone currently alive could remember. It would have been a straightforward thing to plaster them smooth, to bring them into the same warm white palette as the quarters. It would have been a mistake. These walls had a story in their texture that plastering would have erased, and that story was part of what made this tower what it was. So they remained, cleaned, stabilized, honestly preserved, wearing their history the way things that have been through something real always wear it. The lantern room at the summit became the most extraordinary space in the property. Not because of what was added to it but because of what was already there, the view. In every direction, the desert extended itself to the horizon with the absolute confidence of something that has never needed to be anything other than what it is. To the east, the pale earth of the early morning. To the west, the direction from which the afternoon light came most directly. To the north and south, the flat immensity of a landscape that makes you understand, immediately and without argument, how small any individual thing is and how briefly any individual moment lasts. A light was returned to the lantern room. Not the original mechanism, that was gone beyond recovery. But a light that honored the original purpose. That cast its beam across the desert at night the way it had once cast it across the routes that caravans traveled. That reminded anyone who saw it from a distance that someone was here. That this place was inhabited again. That the long silence was over. The keeper's quarters were where the human part of this story had always lived. The tower was for the light. The quarters were for the person who tended it, who climbed those stairs in the middle of the night, who kept the mechanism running, who lived in this desert not because it was easy but because the work required it. That person was gone. Had been gone for a long time. But the space they had inhabited, rebuilt now with care and honesty, carried something of them still. The main living space was designed around warmth. Not temperature, though the materials chosen here held and radiated heat in a way that made the evenings in this desert genuinely comfortable rather than merely survivable. Emotional warmth. The warmth of a space that has been thought about as a place where someone will actually live rather than simply occupy. Thick walls plastered in a warm clay finish that moved between ivory and pale gold depending on the light and the hour. Floors of large format terracotta tile, handmade, each one slightly irregular in the way that fired earth is always slightly irregular, warm underfoot in the morning and cool by the afternoon when the stone had absorbed what the air gave it. Furniture chosen for its honesty. Solid wood in warm tones, not polished to a reflective finish but oiled and burnished, the grain visible, the material present rather than concealed. Linen and canvas in the sandy neutrals of the surrounding landscape. Shelves of aged timber holding things that belonged here, ceramic vessels, objects of rough stone, books whose spines had faded in other desert lights before they arrived in this one. Nothing placed for effect. Everything placed because it belonged. The bedroom was the quietest room in the property. It faced east, for the morning light that in this desert arrives with a gentleness that the rest of the day does not sustain, soft and golden and almost apologetic, as though the sun understands that there are hours when even a desert should be gentle. The walls here were the palest they were anywhere in the building, almost white, but with enough of the clay warmth in them to keep them from coldness. The floor continued in terracotta, but smaller format here, more intimate in its scale. A bed of solid wood with linen in tones pulled directly from the landscape outside. A single window, positioned with great precision to catch exactly the right quality of morning light and nothing else. To sleep in this room and wake in this room was the experience the entire restoration had been working toward. Not drama. Not the kind of beauty that announces itself and demands acknowledgement. The other kind, the kind that you only notice after you have been in its presence for a while, that reorganizes something in you quietly, that makes the ordinary act of waking up feel like something worth paying attention to. The kitchen carried the warmth of the rest of the quarters but added to it the particular pleasure of a space designed for genuine use. Handmade ceramic tiles in the warm whites and sandy golds of the desert. A preparation surface of rough-cut local stone, cool and honest and marked already with the signs of use that every working kitchen surface should carry. Copper vessels hanging where they belonged. A window above the preparation area that looked out onto the courtyard, and through the courtyard to the tower, and past the tower to the desert that had been here before any of this and would be here after all of it. The bathroom was the room that surprised people most. Not because it was the most dramatic or the most elaborately designed, but because of the quality of stillness it held. Deep walls. Small, precise windows that admitted light without surrendering privacy. A bath of hammered copper that had been made for this room by someone who understood the material the way people who work with their hands for long enough come to understand their materials, intuitively, completely, in a way that cannot be fully translated into words. A floor of pebble mosaic, each stone set by hand, that referenced the desert outside in the most direct possible way. The desert was made of this, of these small individual pieces of earth pressed together by time and pressure into something that held. There is a question that comes up whenever a space like this is restored. It is not a design question or a material question or a question about budget or timeline. It is a deeper question, and it deserves a direct answer. Why? Why take a forgotten building in a difficult landscape and spend the time and the thought and the care that a restoration like this demands? Why not simply build something new, something without the complications of damaged structure and scarred surfaces and the particular challenges that come with working in a place this remote and this indifferent to human convenience? Why return to something that has been left behind rather than moving forward into something that has not? The answer is not sentimental, though it can sound that way. It is not about the romance of old buildings or the aesthetics of decay or the picturesque quality that abandoned things sometimes hold before they are touched. It is something more practical than that, and more important. When you restore a building like this, when you take the time to understand it before you change it, when you make decisions that honor its original intention rather than overriding it with yours, when you work with what is there rather than replacing it with something easier, you are participating in a continuity that matters. You are acknowledging that the people who built this place made something worth preserving. That the decisions they made about where to put a wall and how thick to make it and what material to use for the floor were decisions made with care, by people who understood their landscape and their materials and their purpose, and that this care deserves to be met with care in return. There is also something that happens to a restored space that does not happen to a new one. A new building, however well designed, begins its existence without history. It has to earn its atmosphere over time, has to acquire through use and occupation the quality of presence that older spaces carry in their very structure. A restored building carries that quality already. It has been somewhere. It has held people and light and seasons in the particular way that time moves through spaces that are genuinely inhabited. This cannot be manufactured. It can only be preserved. The desert understood this long before any human being did. It preserves things. Not gently, the desert is not a gentle preserver. But completely. A thing that survives the desert survives because it is fundamentally sound, because its essential nature is strong enough to withstand what the environment does to surfaces and details and everything that is not structural. This lighthouse survived. Which meant it was, at its core, worth returning to. That is all a restoration really is. A return. A decision that something is worth coming back to. A commitment to the idea that the best things do not need to be replaced, they need to be seen again, clearly, and cared for honestly, and returned to the world in a form that allows them to continue being what they always were. The light came on for the first time at dusk. Not with ceremony. Not with an audience. The desert does not perform for audiences, and a place that has lived in the desert long enough learns that from it. The light simply came on, the way lights do, and it cast itself out across the pale earth in every direction the way it had once cast itself out across the trade routes and the caravans and the people who had looked up at it from the darkness and understood that they were not alone. The keeper's quarters held warmth in every room. The courtyard held the sound of water and the long shadows of the palms in the last of the evening light. The tower rose from the desert floor exactly as it had always risen, the tallest thing for 40 miles, exactly as it had been built to be. Inside, the terracotta floors held the day's warmth the way fired earth always holds warmth, slowly released, long after the source is gone. The clay walls moved between gold and shadow as the last of the light shifted. The copper caught what remained of the sun and held it a moment longer than everything else, the way copper does, as though reluctant to let the day end. Outside, the desert settled into its evening self. Cooler now. The colors that had been bleached to suggestions of themselves all day deepened as the light changed, the pale gold becoming amber, the sandy neutrals finding warmth they had held in reserve, the sky moving through the register of colors that only desert skies produce at the end of a clear day, colors that have no accurate names and do not need them. The lighthouse stood in all of it. Part of the landscape now in a way that it had perhaps never fully been before, not imposing itself on the desert but belonging to it, anchored in its pale earth, shaped by its light, honest about its materials and its history and its purpose. It was not a ruin anymore. It was not a restoration either, not exactly, not in the sense of something returned to a fixed point in the past and held there artificially. It was simply itself. Found again. Returned to the world. Lit. And the desert, which had been waiting for this the way the desert waits for everything, without urgency, without doubt, with the absolute patience of something that has always known it has time, accepted it back without comment. As it had always been. As it was again. As, now, it would remain.